OODAcast, informing your decisions with intelligence, analysis, and insight. Brought to you by the team at OODAloop.com.
Hi, this is Matt DeVoe, and welcome to the OODAcast. And today we are joined by Joe Sullivan, who's had a very long career in the cybersecurity industry. Joe, thanks for joining the OODAcast, and I'd love to hear a bit about your background and your pathway to getting involved in cybersecurity.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Happy to have this conversation with you. So I grew up in Massachusetts in the 1980s, went to college in the late 80s, and I was focused on, I was always interested in technology, and I have a brother who's a software engineer and another brother who does product work. And so we always kind of talked about technology at home, and we're doing, experimental things whenever we could. But I'd always thought I wanted to work for the government. And so my focus was on trying to do government service. And my intention was to go to law school and then go right into the government. And I got to law school, and I was fortunate enough to get a clerkship, a summer internship with the U.S. Department of Justice. And then I applied. And when I got out of law school, I went into the Department of Justice. The only way you can get in right out of school was something called their Honor Law Grad program. So I was fortunate enough to get into the Department of Justice, and was doing a lot of immigration policy and issues like that around migration and border crossing. There was a new immigration law I went to DC and helped work on implementation of in the late 90s. And it was during that time that I don't know how I became the advocate, but I became the advocate inside the Department of Justice for using technology more. Especially when you're dealing with things like immigration, you need to understand different parts of the world and what's going on. If you take, for example, political asylum cases. And so back in 1995, I was working in San Francisco, and I convinced my office to give me a direct internet connection. And they wouldn't let me connect like my Department of Justice computer to it or anything like that. But I just became the person who was doing, dragging a little tech into the Department of Justice there. And then I had the good fortune to become a federal prosecutor. And I moved to Las Vegas to be a federal prosecutor. And a couple of weeks in, my manager came into my office and said, "You're the only prosecutor who has a computer on his desk. Can you be we have to have somebody be our high-tech crime coordinator for the district. And you'll get a bunch of specialized training and equipment. It's this new program." And I said, "Yeah, sign me up." And so that's how, 1998 and 1999, I started doing cybercrime case prosecutions in Las Vegas. And it became kind of like my half-time job there. And I just love doing those cases. The complexity of trying to understand the technology and explain, the role of a prosecutor is often to explain the complicated area to a jury or people who aren't experts. And so I continue to be that kind of bridge between technology that was quickly changing and people who didn't understand it. And I feel like that's been the foundation of my whole career.
Interesting. It reminds me, I think I did the first ever kind of open source intelligence presentation for the FBI back in 96 or 97. And those were the first field agents. They brought in agents from every field office. They were the first ones to be issued laptop computers, and they referred to themselves as the cyber ninjas, but they had no idea how to use them. And in particular, I remember giving this briefing all day, and then at the end of the day, someone standing up and saying, just remember, you can't use any of these techniques yet, which struck me as kind of interesting. They had the laptops, they had the access to the network, but they weren't allowed to, at least at the time, to engage in kind of the open source intelligence gathering. So you get involved at the Department of Justice from a computer crime perspective, and then what led to you moving into the private sector, and take us through your private sector career component.
Sure. So I was living and working in Vegas doing half-time cyber and the rest white collar. And Robert Mueller had been appointed as the U.S. attorney here in Northern California. Right around that time frame. And he's the same one who started the CSIP. When he was at Maine Justice, he had started CSIPs, which is the computer crime section in Maine Justice. So now he's the U.S. attorney overseeing Silicon Valley, and he decided I need a dedicated full-time high-tech unit in Silicon Valley of federal prosecutors. And so I had moved from San Francisco to Vegas, and the idea of moving back was definitely on my mind, because if you spend time living in Vegas, you realize you don't want to raise kids there necessarily, at least not back in those days. I think it's developed a lot differently as a community now outside of the Strip. But back then, I was just thinking I wanted to get back to Northern California. And then to see a posting that was just spot on what I would love to do, I applied for it, got the opportunity to transfer back at the end of 1999 to work in Northern California. And so I started working at the U.S. Attorney's Office in San Jose, which really was the heart of Silicon Valley back then. And my job under Mueller was to go to the companies and say, hey, I'm with the government. I'm here to help. Tell us about all your cybercrime. And, it was great. They were very reluctant to talk about anything bad back then. There weren't a lot of laws around transparency, and most companies didn't want to celebrate or draw attention to their challenges. But we did doing a lot of interesting cases, and I built relationships with people in a lot of companies. And then after a while, in a couple of years of doing that, companies started trying to pull people like me out of the Department of Justice and into the tech companies. And a good friend of mine, someone who's a big mentor for me, he had been a federal prosecutor. His name's Rob Chestnut. Rob was the senior VP at eBay in charge of trust and safety. And he said, my job keeps growing. Can you come in and join my team at eBay? And he said something that stuck with me forever, and that I share with people who've kind of made that transition from public to private sector. If you find the right role in the private sector, you can feel like you're having as much an impact on safety and security as you did when you were with the government. And the thing Rob said was, as a prosecutor, you deal with the bad thing after it happened. I really need someone like you who could come into eBay and help us design policies ahead of time to prevent the bad thing from happening. And so that was intriguing. I'd never worked inside a corporation or a company and didn't have any background in business, but I thought I'd give it a try. And so I moved into eBay and worked on the trust and safety team, and spent a lot of time kind of engaging with law enforcement and thinking about cybercrime from the perspective of eBay customers.
So you're at eBay. I think it's possibly the first time that we met, although briefly back in the eBay days. And then from there, transition over to Facebook. Was that the next iteration?
Yeah, I was in this situation where, so I'd spent 8 years with the government as a lawyer, and I went into the private sector, and I was doing a little bit of legal work and a lot of operational security work. And at a certain point, I thought, I need to pick one. I need to be either a lawyer or a security person. And I decided I should try being a lawyer. And so I transitioned over to the PayPal side of the company. That was when PayPal was part of the eBay Inc. umbrella of companies, back to Skype at the same time too. And I got to work on projects for all of those companies. But at a certain point, I said, I'll go over to PayPal. The general counsel for eBay Inc. needed somebody to be a senior leader on the PayPal legal team, helping their general counsel. And so I went over to PayPal, and in about 6 months, I realized I don't want to be a banking lawyer. And I really enjoyed the security work a lot more. I ended up spending a lot of time, even though I was technically, running the North America legal team for PayPal, I ended up spending a lot of time with Michael Barrett's team. Michael is the CISO at PayPal. Andy Steingrubel and I worked on that PayPal's responsible disclosure policy that we published back then. We were, I think, one of the first companies to do responsible disclosure. And I got to work with Andy on that, and just in general, couldn't stop doing the security work. And also, the eBay security team kept pulling me back into dealing with a big project, which was back then a large percentage of our our problem users, if you will, were in Romania because of the cybercrime economy there. And I spent a lot of time, even while I was at PayPal, over in Romania doing training for the law enforcement, fighting, meeting with legislators, trying to change their laws, doing actual enforcement actions, fighting with the ISPs that wouldn't cooperate in terms of turning over phishing data, et cetera. And so I just couldn't get rid of the operational side. Then I got a cool opportunity to go over to Facebook in 2008 and get out of being a banking lawyer officially. And in a very short time at Facebook, the security team ended up reporting to me, and then I was made the CSO there, and kind of gave up on that debate between legal and operational security, and became focused on security full time, and that was the rest is history.
Yeah. How many years are you at Facebook? I know it was during a very, very impactful period of time for the company from a growth perspective.
Yeah, when I joined in 2008, we were smaller than MySpace. People still talked about MySpace as like the coolest thing, and by the time I left, we were a big public company with over 1 billion users and almost 20,000 employees. So I got to see it a lot. Took over a very small, really high quality, very small security organization at Facebook, and kind of built it up into hundreds of people, and figured out how to do that while I was doing it. I learned a lot during those years.
Sure. You seem to have a great knack for managing highly technical, kind of eclectic folks as well. To what would you attribute that? Your early interest in technology, your ability to kind of translate between tech and policy? How did you navigate building such a great team and keeping them working efficiently?
Yeah, it's, I think, from a manager and leader standpoint, one of the things we all struggle with at the beginning of becoming a leader is we assume that we have to be as competent in each area as everyone we manage. And I guess probably I have throughout my career been put in these situations where the opposite was true. I'll never forget when I became a federal prosecutor in Las Vegas, I had 2 days of training, and then my manager pushed me into a meeting. He's like, go into that room. And I walk into a room, and there's 3 FBI agents who have 20 years of experience. They've got guns on their hips, and I've never interacted with an FBI agent in my life. And they're expecting me to tell them what's okay and what's not okay. And they briefly lay out in 5 minutes, all right, we want to go kick in this door tonight, and we need a search warrant, or do we need a search warrant, or can we just go kick in the door, and and can we take their computers and all this stuff? And I'm just like, wait, you're asking me for to oversee you doing this stuff? And then I would just listen, ask a bunch of questions, and run back to my manager and be like, what am I supposed to say? But you realize it's not my job to do their job as the leader, as the person giving them guidance. It's my job to figure out how to help them do their job as well as they can, and course correct them when they are their vision isn't as broad as yours, because as the leader, you just get to see how all the different pieces fit together. And when you have the strong people who are in a narrower function, their biggest weakness is often their inability to see outside of their lane. And so I've tried to focus on more kind of how do I figure out who are the strong, high-performing people, and then I just try and get in front of them and clear the way for them to succeed, rather than, try and micromanage them.
Which I also think that many would interpret as kind of loyal to their technical capability, right? If you're clearing the way for them, most want to work in a kind of friction-free, distraction-free, point me in the right direction and let me execute. So to the extent that you keep that pathway clear, I'm sure that instills a lot of loyalty from the technical teams as well.
Yeah, because especially in security, we're going against the grain of a lot of the organization that we're operating within. It's just a reality that security involves asking people to slow down and think about risk and spend some time and money managing those risks. And so, for those strong technical people, they got into it because they like the technical challenges, and they find that interaction, and I'm stereotyping a little bit, but like a lot of those technical people on my teams, they would find that the debate over, whether to implement the technical solution, it's just so draining for them, because that's not their passion, that's not their interest. And I happen to have a training in how to interact with people and use words to convince them to think about things from our perspective. And that's basically the definition of what you learn in law school. And so if I could bring that experience to bear and help them to be able to get their technical work done, like we complement each other.
Yeah. Perfect. Before we move on, I did want to ask you, obviously worked a lot in kind of these kind of multi-jurisdictional international computer crime issues. Back then, it was certainly really the wild, wild west. There weren't a lot of mutual agreements or compatibility between the different nations. How would you interpret that situation as it exists today? I still know that there's some holes in the net, but what's your perception on international computer crime cooperation today?
Yeah, it's funny. I think it's a lot better, but it still has a long way to go. Like when I was just going back to when I was at eBay, one time I spent almost a month in India traveling around the country, training law enforcement and talking about the internet and because the natural reaction when internet crime started happening in India was we should hold the platforms accountable. And so our country manager for eBay in India, he got arrested because somebody had put up a listing on eBay saying, I have a video that I'll sell. No, he didn't actually put the video on, but the video was troublesome in the eyes of the government. And so they didn't know who put it on or who actually had the video, but they knew that like our platform was used to advertise for potential sales. So they arrested our country manager. And so I went and, the rest of our VPs were flying away from India, and I flew in to go and talk to the law enforcement and legislators and everybody and say, like, okay, how are you thinking about crime on the internet? And do you think it is a good thing for your country to go after, the companies that are trying to bring tech platforms to your country, and how do we think about crime, and how do you do international investigations, and how do you gather the data? So back in those eBay years, I think I did training across Eastern Europe, Asia, North America, just try and get people to think about the technology and how to do the investigations. And like just concepts like MLATs, the mutual legal assistance treaties that the governments would have to use to get evidence across borders, were so painful and would take 6 months to get like one set of IPs. And so you'd have an investigation that would just sit on ice for 6 months while you waited for those IPs. Then you would move on to the next step of the investigation when you finally got the records. And it was just like, so like that world is much more efficient. But we still, like one of the challenges is getting the country, the country where the victim is always has an incentive to help the victim because that's their citizen. But the country where the perpetrator is doesn't have the same incentives. And like everyone, they have limited enforcement budget. And are they going to spend it going after their people to protect citizens of another country? It's a hard sell, sure. even if it's a country that's fully in favor of the rule of law.
It's interesting. So it almost dictates that the criminals will target people outside their own country just for that exact reason.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of us are watching and listening from a distance to the conversation right now about the MGM situation, and I keep hearing the speculation and maybe even more concrete than that information that it's that some of the people responsible are in the United States, and you're just like, wow, we haven't seen that in a while. Mm-hmm. If it'll be interesting to see if that proves to be true or not. I have no idea, but like we just haven't seen that inside the United States at a scale or significance of an event like this.
I saw the TLP Red presentation on that last week. The evidence seems pretty convincing for U.S. citizen involvement. So it will be interesting to watch that evolve. Cool. So next, from Facebook off to Uber as the chief security officer or chief information security officer there?
Yeah, so I was towards the end of 2014. Things were going well at Facebook. I had a really great team, and maybe it was getting a little restless for some chaos, but Uber reached out. And the first interactions I had with Uber was they sent over a technical team, their CTO and a bunch of people came over to Facebook because they said, we have a big problem, which is we haven't figured out how to lock down internal access to customer data well. And we had put a lot of time and energy into that at Facebook on my team because that's a fundamental trust issue inside a place like Facebook. You don't want your employees to go spelunking in customer data unless there's a really legit business purpose. And so there's a lot of sensitive data that's very attractive. And so we've done a lot of work to lock it down there. And if you think about Uber at the end of 2014, it was like the biggest security nightmare, house on fire situation you can imagine. They had all these stories about insiders abusing access to user data that have been in the news. There was they went public with this data breach from 2014, but like a while after it had happened, at least in the perception from the outside, there was like, why'd you sit on it so long? And then there was a third thing. There was a really tragic sexual assault situation in India where a driver was accused of sexually assaulting a passenger. That was playing out in global news. And so the company was just like, their board knew and the CEO knew we need to make a major investment in security. And so they pushed hard to recruit me, and they said, we'll basically give you an unlimited budget and you can go and tackle all these hard problems for us. We think we're going to be a big, successful company, but this is one of the areas where we're falling way short. And it seemed like a really interesting challenge. So I made the move, and I was fortunate. A bunch of people from my team, I think between people who'd worked for me at eBay and Facebook, over 40 people followed me there. And we were able to pretty quickly build a team from, again, I inherited a security team of like less than 5 and built it up into hundreds in a couple of years.
Yeah.
So
excellent. I think testament to your leadership skills that many people would follow you. It is interesting though, with regards to that model, you're at eBay and users are interacting with each other. And obviously there's a transfer of physical goods, but then you go to Facebook, there's not really a lot of physical interaction, maybe in marketplace, but then you go to Uber and, the two parties at Uber are interfacing with each other in the physical world, right? So it adds a whole new element of risk to, how information is protected and how people are put on the platform. So I could see where that would be an interesting and unique challenge because it was something that you hadn't encountered before. At that level.
We had dealt with it at eBay. We acquired a bunch of local classified platforms around the world, and we were a minority investor in Craigslist. So from a trust and safety standpoint, I had thought a lot about and worked on how do you deal with, classifieds ultimately lead to an in-person interaction.
Sure.
So we had thought about it in that context. And then I was an advisor for Airbnb while I was at Facebook. So I was thinking about and helping the Airbnb trust and safety team deal with, their version of that digital platform brings together two people in the physical world. And so I had been thinking about it from the Airbnb perspective. And honestly, it was what excited me the most about going to Uber, and that the area that I spent the most time on personally was what we call trust and safety, which was focused on the rider and the driver and ensuring that it's a safe experience. And it turns out there's so much you can do with technology to impact that and reduce the risk of those in-person situations going badly. And I don't think enough has been written about all the work that the trust and safety team did at Uber and has continued to do after I left in terms of not just analyzing the feedback from prior rides, but like we did things during my time there. Like we integrated a selfie mechanism into the app. So like one of the trust and safety issues was, somebody gets cleared as a driver, they do the background check, they have insurance, all those things. And how do we know that that person's actually showing up as the driver the next week with the car when somebody presses a button in order to ride? And so we set up a technology that randomly, every so often, would ask the driver to take a selfie, especially if we see like a driver all of a sudden putting in 11-hour days, 7 days in a row. You're like, sure, the math doesn't add up. Time to pop a selfie question at them, and then we can compare it to their driver's license that we have on file. And we used some APIs from Microsoft's photo recognition stuff and made it work great. We did a lot of things like that. We did, I think we call it, we looked at the data on rides. You can, the driver's phone and the rider's phone are sitting in a car that's moving through space and time. And so we could tell if a driver had their phone mounted or they were holding it in their hand. Mm-hmm. And believe me, as an Uber rider, there's nothing more disconcerting than sitting in the back seat and having the driver having the phone in their hand. You're just like, it's just scary, right? And so we were able through telematics to figure out and tell those drivers, if you don't put it in a dock, we're not giving you any more rides. Mm-hmm. And so like, there's so many little things like that. You can use technology to make the rides safer. You can also, map out like, what is the most efficient route? And if a driver starts taking them down a dark alley instead, then you can like pop up a question to the rider, do you feel safe right now? Like there's so much you can do with technology to impact real world safety that is just amazing chance for that company to work on.
Yeah, it was unprecedented too, right? With the compute power and all the capabilities on these mobile platforms gave those the opportunity to run applications like that or engage in those type of safety measures.
Exactly.
Yeah. Cool. So while at Uber, there was an incident that occurred that resulted in some legal issues for you. Can you step us through kind of the timeline with regards to what happened?
Yeah, it was a security incident that happened in the fall of 2016. We thought we resolved it well as a team by the end of that year, and kind of just dealt with it and moved on. And then it kind of re-emerged in the fall of 2017. What had transpired in the interim was so if the second half of 2016, the tail end of 2016, right around during the time of that incident, I was working on a few other crazy things at Uber. As was always the case there was never just one crazy thing going on. But at the tail end of 2016 was when Donald Trump was elected president in November of 2016. And our CEO had agreed to be on, I don't even remember what, a transition committee that led to a lot of protests outside of our offices that our CEO was being supportive of the future Trump presidency, was not well received in our driver community and in San Francisco proper. And so it was just kind of chaos around that. And then the company had some other major issues around the work environment and treatment of minorities and women, and our CEO just kind of kept going through these crazy things that were getting magnified in the media and put a lot of pressure on the company from the outside. And in the spring of 2017, he ended up taking a leave of absence, and then ultimately, I think, was forced to step down from the company. The group of us who reported to them then became essentially co-CEOs. So we were co-CEOs of Uber through the summer of 2017, essentially 9 of us running a $40 billion company, and kind of trying to do it all together and in coordination with the board was definitely an experience I'll never repeat. And it was it was hard, but it was also rewarding. But in the end, we hired a new CEO who hired a new general counsel, and the board had brought in outside lawyers, and it was kind of like, let's do a massive review of everything that happened in the last couple of years under the old CEO. And at a certain point, the company decided we need to do, there should have been a data breach disclosure on that incident the prior year. We thought that technically Joe's team handled it perfectly, but like from a legal standpoint, there should have been a disclosure. And then in November of 2017, the company chose to do that disclosure while I was out on vacation, and chose to pre-brief some reporters and tell them that I had done a cover-up. And so I was up on vacation with my family in the mountains for Thanksgiving week, doing some grocery shopping, and I got a phone call saying that I needed to join an urgent meeting, and there was an email in my inbox with a severance contract that I refused to sign, and so I was terminated on that day.
Wow. So to unpack a little bit around the breach itself and kind of the way that the team handled it, are you allowed to speak to that? Can you step us through what the situation was? Because I had a couple of threads that I wanted to pull on that possibly.
Yeah, so I still have an appeal pending on my case, so I have to be careful about how I talk about the underlying facts. The way I've been able to talk, I have talked about it. I've given a couple of talks at conferences, and in fact, the talk I gave at Defcon is public and it's on the internet, and I walked through some of the facts of the case. And the way I was able to do that and walk through it was I can share what I saw sitting in the courtroom. So the good news is that there was a lot of transparency through my trial of what actually happened in the underlying investigation. And so it's all in the public record now, in the trial record. And so I can talk about what's in that record. What I probably can't do is talk about like what I remember from back in 2016 during the actual incident, and sure, 2016 and 17. So just to kind of like keep it safe from like a appeal record and what might happen in the future standpoint.
Yeah. So can you give the kind of the highlights of the stuff that was discussed at Defcon with regards to what was presented in the court?
Yeah. So one morning there was an email in my inbox. I think it was in the morning. There was an email in my inbox saying I found a vulnerability, or I forget the exact words, but it's the kind of email that I would get once a week, where somebody says, I found vulnerability in your company, pay me. And I always would just forward those over to the guy who ran the bug bounty team underneath the head of product security. And so I usually would just forward them to him without even like saying anything, so I just like literally forward it and then I delete it. Mm-hmm. And so I did that. And then the team had a playbook that they followed for those things. We had all the written formal data breach response policies and, multi-layers of those policies, and then execution run books and things like that. And the team immediately sent a response to the person and said, hey, we typically handle these through our HackerOne bug bounty program. You should be doing it through there, but send me like evidence that you actually have access. And they sent some stuff. The team, this was before I got looped back in, the team saw enough to be convinced that they thought there might actually be access. So they spun up an incident response. They looped in the communications and legal people that that are dictated that they include as in any IR response situation. And then it kind of went from there. The people on the other side wanted to stay anonymous. My team wanted to figure out who they were, but also didn't want to spook them. My team figured out it was guessed that they were probably teenagers, young guys in the United States and Canada. Ultimately figured out it was a 19 and 20-year-old, one in Florida, one in over the border in Canada. Interacted with them, and then kind of went into full attribution mode. And I wish that this part I could have gone into in detail during my public talk, but like I think sooner or later someone needs to do a public talk on the details of the attribution side of it, because it was really well done by my team. You know, because of like the history of working at places like eBay and Facebook, and dealing with what we were talking about these international cases where we always valued the attribution as part of our work, because if you understand who's on the other side, you understand what the risks are to your organization, and you understand their motivation. It helps you in your investigation to, as you dig deeper into your logs, like, okay, if it's a nation state, you're like, I really got to go check in this direction, and we got to turn over every rock. And if it's a straight up bug bounty, then you're like, okay, we should make sure we don't have lateral movement or stuff like that. But like, you just have different, like the team will respond differently, and also who else you'll bring in and how you'll handle it. So the team did attribution and was able to, through kind of like some tried and true things that we've done in other cases in the past, essentially have a back and forth until the other side makes a mistake and exposes themselves a little bit. And that's kind of like the cat and mouse game in a lot of these cases that I've seen up close. And in this case, the thing that actually was successful in getting the first piece of data to help pin down the attribution was we sent them an NDA through a document signing platform that we thought would not allow them to obfuscate their IP, and sure enough, it worked. And so even though their origin IP was delivered to us nice and neatly, and then we were able to kind of combine that with some other data and do the attribution. And so then one of the members of my team flew to Florida and to Canada, and another member of the team sent a note to them and said, hey, and we actually sent it to their real email addresses, and we just said, hey, you guys, thanks for working with us, but like, we need you to sign everything in your real names, and we also want to meet with you to make sure that you truly did delete the data that you had access to. And so my team, we had somebody who's a former CIA employee who was an expert in interrogation. He met physically with each of the two people, interviewed them, wrote up whole psychological analysis reports on them, concluded that, when they said they deleted it, it's deleted. There's no risk that our customers' data is going to get dumped in the wild. And they signed everything. We invited them to come out to California to meet with our team, meet with our company. We wanted them to walk through. A couple of members of my team thought that they were really good at obfuscation of their identity, and that there was stuff that like we could learn from it. We even referred one of them, like from our standpoint, we concluded one of them was like the technical expert and the other was not so much. And for the technical guy, we were trying to help him, find a job in cybersecurity, and even referred him to some places and stuff like that. So, that's when I say that, like, the way the evidence came in, when it got to my sentencing hearing, the judge said, the government and Uber had always presented the NDA as a cover-up, and the judge said at my sentencing, he said that's not what the evidence showed, because the judge understood it was about attribution, and he said this is an unprecedented case. Like, the data's not out in the wild, nobody got harmed, and yet it shows up on the list of biggest data breach cases ever, but like there's no actual harm, which is very different from pretty much everything else on those lists. So the judge, I was very grateful at my sentencing that he said that this was a really excellent technical job by my team. Even Dara Khosrowshahi, the subsequent CEO of Uber, when he testified, he said that the right thing to do was to pay the money and secure the data, and like technically everything was done really well by my team, world class. And it took 6 years to get that recognized. And I'm really happy because I'm very proud of that team and how hard they worked and how they handled this case. And they had this case hanging over them for, the last 6 years. And to have their side, and they've all had to go work at other companies and have people, give them side-eye looks about this case. And, I would much rather that the world look at them with appreciation for what they did to protect our customers.
Yeah. So I mean, at the end of the day, and it seems you identify, you do the attribution, you realize that it's not. I don't want to say it's not a real threat, but it's not an entity that is kind of truly criminal. They more are on that kind of security research side of the framing, maybe a little bit more from an obfuscation perspective, trying to protect themselves, which maybe is right or wrong depending on how they're discovering vulnerabilities. And you do the attribution, and I'm sure if you had determined that this was a criminal organization or they had criminal intent, the pathway would have been different. But in this instance, you chose to mitigate and resolve, and to a certain extent it sounds like almost mentor, somebody who famously had to fight those battles with CEOs in the 90s about why are you hiring this person who's a self-declared hacker, where you're making the judgment case. They were curious, they were looking for areas in which to demonstrate their expertise. They maybe were looking for ways to monetize the expertise legitimately through some of these programs, thus the outreach. And you chose not to pursue the criminal realm, to kind of treat this as it was kind of a bug bounty. So it seems like there's a side tragedy here with regards to those who want to find this type of behavior and encourage them in the right direction. Vice always treat it as a black and white issue. There is a little bit of shade of gray here where people are influenceable, and you can do right by them by framing this in the proper way.
That's why I did the Defcon talk. Was I've gotten lots of invitations to meet and speak with security leaders about the risks and what does this case stand for to that community. And I do those conversations. I have a lot of one-on-one conversations with security executives when they're starting to panic in their situation. They'll call me and be like, Joe, this is what I'm seeing at my company. What should I, how do I get a lawyer? How do I get a PR person? How do I get myself out of this situation so I don't end up like you? I've had that conversation a million times. Fortunately, most of those people who call me in a panic, their situation diffuses and doesn't end up in a bad place, but sometimes they do. And so I've had that conversation with large CISO groups, small CISO groups, lots of different contexts. The conversation that I hadn't had that I wanted to have was this angle about the research side of it, because I had, and so that's why I did the Defcon talk, was I wanted to look at the case through the lens of a security researcher, which is, a lot of the people at Defcon, that's their perspective. And that was the perspective, honestly, of a bunch of members of my team who, a couple of them testified during the trial that they essentially related to these guys because that was they weren't too far away from them when they started, their internet security career as teenagers, before they, found the right mentors and stuff like that. And so, because the incentives, it's really important for us to get them right. We need to have better cooperation between companies and researchers. We also need to have better cooperation between companies and government. And that's a whole other category that I worry that my case, and, I didn't do the, I didn't think about, this is what I said at my sentencing to the judge. I said, I thought about this case, like during the case, I thought about the perspective of my company, my team, our customers, and the researchers. But what I didn't give enough thought to was the perspective of the government and them wanting to be in the loop and them thinking that they have a right to be in the loop. And so that, I would like to better role model partnership between the public and private sectors. I mean, the biggest irony for me is that I'd spent my whole career trying to build the dynamic between the public and private sector on cybersecurity. I was on President Obama's Cyber Commission at the time this incident happened, and I was the person who was, in Washington, D.C. regularly championing, we have to get, we need more investment in, what's now CISA and organizations like that, actually helping the private sector keep itself secure and that it be collaborative. And now I'm like the poster child for not cooperating. So that's something I definitely regret.
Yeah. Yeah, which I guess becomes a disclosure issue, but I think it's also kind of makes the whole issue of bug bounties a little complex, because there are some bug bounties that by their nature are going to expose PII or whatnot. And does that become a reportable instance every time? I think, it just kind of it complicates maybe some of the approaches here. What I also found surprising, though, and again, we didn't clear any questions, so if you can't answer, feel free, but it seemed like that your role was kind of on an island. And when we think about companies, and I think at one point I actually read early in the trial, the judge made a comment about recognizing that one of the seats at the trial was empty and that seat should be occupied by Uber. So what do you think the lessons learned are with regards to kind of corporate accountability in this issue, vice executive accountability? And were there any surprises with regards to kind of how isolating that journey was as the case progressed?
Yeah, it definitely. So I have two different kind of thoughts on this. One is just from the perspective of being a person going through it. It was an incredibly difficult 6-year journey to go from one day, just seeing yourself labeled as responsible for a cover-up on the front page of every newspaper in the world, to 6 years later having the judge say, it wasn't a cover-up and I'm going to just give you probation, despite the government arguing for prison. I wouldn't have got through it without two things. One was having a really supportive family, and two, having a really supportive community of people out there, people who understood that these are tough situations, and it's challenging and evolving, and it's hard to get it right every time. And the judge, he joked about it at the beginning of sentencing. He's like, I've never gotten so many letters before a sentencing in my career. Don't ever do that again, lawyers, because he had to read hundreds of letters, and a lot of those letters were people in the security community, people I'd worked with over the years, and that support really helped me get through this case, and not feeling like I was alone. I mean, I did feel like I was alone because the company that had hired me was sitting, they had their lawyers in the courtroom sitting, next to the government lawyers, not next to my lawyers. And that side of it was hard. But I think for everybody else who comes after me, the judge gave two really important gifts in that sentencing hearing. The first gift he gave was, he said, next time, the next person's going to prison. And that you'd be like, why is that a gift to security leaders? Yeah. It's because what we didn't have was clarity, and what we had, what we want is our clear lines. And we can say to our companies going forward, okay, we don't have a choice. We have to be transparent. And if we don't be transparent, this is the risk. It's not a penalty, a fine, it's jail. And that'll get the attention of your company. And so that's a gift. The second thing that the judge said at the sentencing, and which he had, like you said, he had said before the trial, he said, there's an empty chair next to Joe, that's the company. After the trial, at the sentencing, he said, I don't understand why Joe's here by himself. His view, the judge literally said on the record, the CEO is at least as culpable as is the company. And so to me, that's the ultimate message that we as security leaders can bring to our executive leadership and the board is, the next time, the judge told the prosecutor, next time you bring the company and the CEO too. So I think those are, those could be conveyed as threats, but I don't think of them that way. I think them as gifts, because they're they're moving us off of being on the island alone and having, the rest of the leadership have to stand with us, which will making them accountable means that they will become more responsible leaders in these areas.
That's really great insight, and it's good to know that, I would not want anyone to go through the journey that you've gone through, for all the reasons that you expressed over how tough it was over the 6 years. But it's certainly, have fear for folks that take those roles as CSO or CISO and feel like they are going to bear all of the responsibility for the actions of the company, which shouldn't be the case. I mean, you're acting within and on behalf of and in coordination with other executives in the company. So it was definitely concerning as the case moved forward, and something that was kind of always on my mind was, again, that isolation. Why is the CEO not there? Why is the company not held accountable as a company? Why is it a single executive in the decision-making structure that is appearing here alone? So it sounds like the judge really took the time, in the least, to understand the case and the nuances of the case and try and provide as much value to the security community, from this journey as possible. It seems like there's just a ton of lessons learned.
Yeah, I was from the start. I always felt like the judge in my case was someone who really earnestly. He really earnestly wanted to understand the issues. He's a passionate believer in the jury system, and he wanted to get to the bottom of it all. I never once felt like when we showed up in a courtroom, he didn't walk in as prepared as everyone else. He did what we would hope a judge will do, which is, try their best to understand it. And I don't, and you think about like a judge, every day they have like a completely different kind of case in front of them. And a lot of people have difficulty understanding the concept of a bug bounty. Most people, when you explain bug bounty up front, kind of react. I'm talking like not a gray area bug bounty situation, but like a totally yes, companies pay money to people who find vulnerabilities. A lot of people react instantly with that's extortion. If they know, if they can see that your car has a flat tire, they should just tell you, not they should get paid for it. But we know, if you're the company, the most efficient way to spend money on getting your security better is to pay researchers, because you only pay when they find something real.
Yep. Well, it is, again, the realignment of those. Sorry, that's the one of two people who has the ability to override silence on my phone. The bug bounty aspect as well changes the incentives, right? So where somebody might be incentivized to pursue maybe more criminal endeavors or selling vulnerabilities on forums, it gives them an economic incentive to work in cooperation with the company. So I think that realignment of incentives is also important. I know we're pushing up towards an hour. I did want to talk a bit about, you also went over to Cloudflare. So, by my count, you've played, major role in some of the most important companies over the course of time, but now we're doing some important work in Ukraine as well. Can you talk to us about kind of the current initiative that you have and what you've been doing recently to help out the citizens of Ukraine?
Yeah. So after I was fired from Uber, I wasn't sure what I was going to be able to do next. And I was very fortunate that Cloudflare did give me a chance to go in and be their chief security officer in 2018. And, Cloudflare was a small pre-IPO company then, but already I thought having a material impact on kind of the internet as a whole and internet security in particular. And so I was very excited to join that company. And I worked there for 4 years. Matthew, the CEO, and Michelle, his co-founder, they were very supportive of everything I was going through, and were comfortable letting it kind of proceed while I worked there. And I was able to, inherit for the third time a very small number of security people, that I could count on one hand yet again, and build it up into a big team over 4 years. And that was very rewarding work at Cloudflare, because Cloudflare gives away a lot of its products for free to people in need in different contexts around the world, and offers a free product for basically everybody, but intentionally goes out of its way to help in difficult situations, because that's just the nature of the founders. And they stood by me even when I got charged. They didn't, when I got charged with a felony, they let me stay on, and that was incredible. That level of support, and during 2022, before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the United States government, as everyone will recall, was warning Russia's going to invade, and nobody believed it, including the Ukrainians. But the U.S. government, Cyber Command, et cetera, asked Cloudflare to help out in getting Ukraine ready in case of an attack. And so a bunch of people at Cloudflare worked closely with the Ukrainian government and the private sector there to get a lot of it behind Cloudflare. And so I got to work on that, and that was very rewarding work. Then summer of 2022, I had to take a leave of absence and leave to go do the trial. And we'd essentially agreed that if I won, I would come back, and if I didn't win, I shouldn't come back, because it would just be too I don't think you can actually hold that role and have a felony conviction. I think I had already seen customers refuse to do business with Cloudflare after I was charged, and I know the names of every one of those companies. They're embedded in my head because I didn't think they should be choosing not to work with Cloudflare, but that's their prerogative. But I didn't want to have a more and worse version of that after the trial. So we reached agreement that if I was going to lose, that I wouldn't come back. And so I just after the trial and losing, just kind of was in a funk for a few weeks. And then I was very fortunate. A good friend and his wife just kind of took me and my fiance away for a weekend. That was the weekend of Thanksgiving. And just kind of slapped me in the face and said, "You got to get off your butt. I need you to come to my event and speak at it in December, and you got to get up and do stuff, and you can't mope." And so after that long weekend with them, I was like, all right, I need to do something. And what was fulfilling? Where can I volunteer? And so I reached out to a few different people and said, I want to do something volunteering in a way that's meaningful. Can you help me out? And I'd done a lot of things in diversity and security over the years. I've been an exec sponsor for our Black employees at Cloudflare and at Uber. And so I was, it was for me, it was either going to be doing some more volunteering in the diversity context, or if I could help out in some kind of cybersecurity way. And so one of the people I reached out to was the recruiter who had placed me both at Uber and at Cloudflare. And so he's a good friend. And I was like, you owe me one, you placed me at Uber. I said, I would like to do something nonprofit related to Ukraine. And he had his recruiter team, his sourcers, contact, I think, literally every nonprofit in the US that was helping Ukraine. And he called me up a while later and he said, Ukraine Friends needs a CEO. And I was like, well, I was hoping to volunteer a few hours a week. I don't know about stepping in as the CEO. I've never been a CEO of a nonprofit. I don't know anything about that stuff. But he said, talk to the board. I talked to them. And they said, look, we'll help you deal with all the things that we know and you don't know about nonprofit land. And so I jumped into it. And this nonprofit, we do a bunch of different things to help the people in Ukraine survive the war. The biggest initiative that I started that's going really well was I've been getting different companies to donate their used laptops, and we bring them over and we give them to kids who are stuck in remote schooling. Yeah. One of the things I've learned I've been to Ukraine twice this year for trips and traveled around the country and met with people all over the country. Half the kids in Ukraine are in remote schooling. They basically were in remote school during the pandemic, and then the war started. So they've been in can you imagine kids in remote schooling for 4 years straight? And then on top of that, the average income for a family in Ukraine before the war was like $2,000 a year. So they're not like going out and buying laptops, and also you can't go online and order a laptop and have it shipped to Ukraine. So there's no access to modern technology. 40% of the kids in remote school in Ukraine are borrowing a family member's phone or other device to participate in remote schooling. So they don't even have their own machine. So I've been getting companies to donate machines. We bring them over. I've gotten companies as small as Tynes, which is like a tiny little cybersecurity company. They're like, we have 10 laptops. Can you take them? Like, that's 10 kids' lives changed, of course.
Sure. Yeah.
All the way up to some big banks and everything in between have participated. And so that's been really rewarding work. I'm planning my 3rd trip of the year to go over the week after Thanksgiving, because my team, when I was in Ukraine in July, they said, Joe, you're getting the laptops, and then we're kind of handing off the laptops to other little nonprofits in Ukraine. How about we launch direct interaction with families ourselves? And I was like, you guys want to take that on? And my team, who's all Ukrainian except for me, they said, yeah, we do. And now, so we basically created a Google form that anyone in Ukraine can fill out and nominate a kid. And I thought we could get swamped, so let's kind of have a minimum bar. And we said, let's just start out trying to get laptops to kids who've lost a parent to the war, and who might be in remote school or just struggling and doesn't have a computer. So we created a form for people to submit. And for the last 2.5 months, we've been getting applications, and we're directly giving laptops out to families. And if it's near where people on my team are, we'll hand deliver it and get to know the kids. And if they're in one of the kind of too close to the front lines, which there are a lot of kids too close to the front lines, we'll actually use the Ukrainian Postal Service to deliver them. And shockingly, the Postal Service operates very well, and laptops show up and function. And we do, we'll do video calls with the kids to make sure that they get set up and things like that. Yeah. So it's been very rewarding work. And, when you go through something hard, all you need to do, like, the best way to reset yourself is go help somebody who's worse off than you, and like the worst. And so during that period between losing the trial and the sentencing and not knowing what was going to happen at the sentencing, I just threw my energy into focusing on, like, these kids, these families, these people in a war zone. They're living through something much worse than I'm living through. And they're showing so much grit, resilience, and you can't help but just get caught up in what they're doing and how you help them, and you forget about your own problems.
Yeah, it gives you a sense of appreciation when you're confronted with somebody else's reality that it's so much worse. Yeah. I mean, living in a war zone, remote school for 4 years, loss of a parent. I mean, there's obviously all tragic for those kids. So thank you for that work that you're doing. Very important. I'll include a link to the nonprofit, when we release this episode of the podcast as well. I do appreciate your time here today. I always ask one question at the close, given that I'm such an avid reader, and that is there a book that you've read or listened to recently that really stuck with you that you might recommend to folks watching this podcast?
I've been that's a good question. I've been doing a lot of reading, trying to understand history in Eastern Europe. And I like, I'm blanking on the name of the book. I just read this book that one of my daughters recommended, but it was from the perspective of an Italian young man growing up during World War II and kind of the role he played. Blanking on the name right now, but
we can dive up and put it in the show notes. That's the beauty of the internet.
Yeah, I can send it to you. But I'm reading a bunch of nonfiction books about the experience. There's an excellent book that I'm reading about Russia at the time when the Tsars kind of got pushed out, at the tail end of World War I, and how the evolution to, the communist government happened, and then kind of looking at how the Nazi situation in Italy was happening. I just find this historical context makes me look at what's happening in a place like Ukraine in a much more nuanced way, because we always need to like think about situations not just from the perspective of the person we relate to the most, but like, I mean, I think about the Ukraine war as a tragedy on all sides. It's like the Russian soldiers who are, forced to march forward. If they turn around, they'll get shot, and if they go forward, they'll get shot. And they signed up for something different. Like, I think that's a tragedy. I think what the kids in Ukraine are going through is a tragedy. There's so many, and so having some historical context, but also thinking about these things from all the different perspectives. Is why I like to read and help me get outside of my own head.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. And there's a lot of, I don't know how big a believer I am in kind of the cycles of history, but, to this date, we certainly have seen some of those cycles. So it's good to understand where the cycles occurred in the past, kind of what the global context was, what were some of the catalysts and what were some of the outcomes, so that we can avoid some of the negative cycle elements in the future. Joe, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat today and for being so candid with your lessons learned and your experience. Really appreciate it. And I'll get those book titles from you, and we'll include them in the show notes as well.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, and thanks for sharing the info about Ukraine Friends, because if any listeners, feel inspired to get their company to donate some laptops, they're, odds are good they're just sitting in a pile somewhere and they've already been wiped. And if they haven't been, get them wiped, and then let's put them to use.
Absolutely. Perfect. All right. Thank you.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to this OODA Loop production. For the latest analysis on cybersecurity, technology, and global risks, please visit www.oodaloop.com.